What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 16 in season 2 of Real Democracy Now!, a podcast. In this episode, I talked to a few of my previous guests about the relationship between representative democracy and capitalism. Some common themes emerge, specifically around the power of capital challenging the power of democratically elected governments, and the problem of growing inequality and the erosion of the welfare state and social democracy. My first guest is Professor Wolfgang Merkel, who spoke about his paper, Is Capitalism Compatible with Democracy? Professor Merkel is the director of the Research Unit, Democracy and Democratization at the WZB Social Science Research Centre in Berlin, as well as heading up the Centre for Global Constitutionalism and a number of other projects. He has written widely on democracy, democratization, social democracy, and democracy and capitalism, to name but a few, in academic and non-academic publications. Professor Merkel is also co-project leader of the Democracy Barometer. And you've written an article titled, Is Capitalism Compatible with Democracy? What's your answer to that question?
The answer is, as so often, not quite easy. I would first say capitalism is compatible with democracy and with dictatorship. But democracy needs capitalism. But here the question starts, which type of capitalism? There is a variety of capitalism. There's a difference again between the Scandinavian capitalist countries and, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon capitalist countries, not to speak of the authoritarian capitalisms you find from Singapore to the People's Republic of China. What makes capitalism problematic for democracy is what I have mentioned before. If you give markets too much power, then democracy may regulate the traffic in your country, but cannot really decide more on monetary matters, on budget matters, on expensive social policies, for example. So giving too much power to the markets, deregulate the market actors, make them as powerful competitors to democratically elected representatives. This is one point. The second point is, again, what we have seen throughout the last 30 years is an increasing inequality in the well-established democracy. I would even say the class questions came back. We have an inequality which is rigid in terms of existence, meaning if children are born into families which are well off, they have a great chance to be well off as well. This is right and nothing against it. This is perfect. But on the other side, if you are born into a poor family and your parents are not educated, then your chance remaining in the lower third of the society is dramatically high. So I would say the narrative of a fair capitalist society that everybody has the same chances to make it, it's becoming more and more a myth. And here is too much of our life chances are decided by markets and not by democratically legitimate selected representatives. The inequality, I would say, is one of the big diseases. The socioeconomic inequality, one of the big diseases of our current democracy. Therefore, it depends very much about which capitalism we are talking about. if there is a socially regulated capitalism, which we have seen after 45, especially in Northern Europe, I think it's quite well compatible. But if you have capitalist societies where politics is not able to include the lower third of the society into the well-being, then democracy fails, at least at this front.
Next, I speak with Professor Leonardo Morlino, who suggests that whilst we can legitimately talk about alternate systems to democracy, asking about alternatives to capitalism is a rhetorical question. Professor Morlino is a professor of political science and the director of the Research Centre on Democracies and Democratization at LUISS in Rome. Professor Morlino is a leading specialist in comparative politics with expertise in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and the phenomenon of democratization. To what extent is the Western model of democracy, and you've mentioned liberal democracy, built upon a particular economic system, and that is capitalism? And do you think representative democracy can operate alongside other economic systems?
You are reminding me the classes that I many years ago was attending, were the classes by Robert Dahl at Yale. Robert Dahl in the 70s, in the middle 70s, was convinced, for example, that Yugoslavia could evolve with the idea of participation, co-managing, co-ownership, could evolve toward a democratic regime. Unfortunately, and I in a sense I regret this because I had a great affection for Robert Dahl. Unfortunately, he was wrong. Capitalism, we could say, is even something stronger and much more rooted in our worldwide reality today than democracy. Think about this very simple point. We can discuss about democracy and alternatives to democracy. And there are big alternatives to democracy, such as Russia, such as some of the countries around Russia, such as China, such as other countries, for example, other remaining alternatives, say, of military regime or mixed cases, what I call a hybrid regime. So even today, there are alternatives to democracy. But the question I address to you, there are alternatives to capitalism today. To tell the truth, it's a rhetoric question. There are not alternatives. So the point is what liberal democracy can do to avoid the worst aspect of capitalism, particularly in terms of inequality, particularly in terms of indifference to poverty, particularly in terms of the great problems that the mankind has in this the world has in these days. Of course, there are enlightened forms of capitalism. A good capitalist entrepreneur may understand that if he does not accept some limitations, say in emission of, say, poisoning the air or polluting, he cannot go on for a long time with this activity. I mean, doing nothing for the climate, doing nothing for the poor can be something even that is against the interests of the capitalism. But we are thinking of enlightened capitalism. So from this point of view, again, democracy can be seen only as a way of controlling, limiting, avoiding the worst aspect of capitalism.
And you were talking before about some examples of the impact of the recent economic crisis on democracy. Are there other aspects that you see economic woes having an impact on democracy as a system of government?
Yes, definitely. First of all, particularly if we look at these last years, a thrust toward centralization, thrust toward trying to give much more power to a key central decisional authority. And then the other aspect that unfortunately is relevant and is part of the old achievement of the worker movements is to have, we say now with a sort of euphemism, more flexible jobs. It is actually the possibility of firing people and to readapt, to change, to reshape the specific firm or the company and so on. That is a kind of eroding of welfare state. That was one of the key aspects, the key big aspect that after World War II was able to revitalize democracy, the invention and development of welfare state. Again, this is another aspect that we should consider. So in a nutshell, to be precise, to reply precisely to your question, the economic crisis, and in a sense, economy has been pushing in these years in two directions in terms of worsening the democracy, and from the point of view of the quality of democracy. One, centralization, the other one, erosion of welfare state. Without declaring it, this is another aspect. Without declaring it, in terms of legitimacy, legitimation, say, rhetoric, narrative, you cannot say we limit or we cut the welfare state. But this happened. This happened in Southern Europe very much. This happened also in Eastern Europe, for example.
I asked Sophia Näsström about a paper she wrote with Sarah Kalm from Lund University titled A Democratic Critique of Precarity, in which they identify precarity as the material and psychological vulnerability resulting from neoliberal economic reforms. Associate Professor Näsström is from the Department of Government at the Uppsala University in Sweden. She works in the field of political theory with particular focus on issues related to democracy, constituent power, the people, the right to have rights, representation, freedom, and precarity. So I've spoken to other democratic theorists about the relationship between representative democracy and free market capitalism. And you've written a paper titled A Democratic Critique of Precarity, which you identify as the material and psychological vulnerability arising or resulting from neoliberal economic reforms. Can you outline your critique and how we might address the issues?
Yes, so precarity is a term that has become increasingly popular as a way to capture the material and psychological vulnerability arising from neoliberal economic reforms. And neoliberal policies, what one thinks about here are often neoliberal policies aimed at making employment conditions more flexible. We see a gradual replacement of welfare protection with welfare obligations. And of course, we see the promotion of market solutions to every sphere of society. So Bourdieu, for instance, in an early account of this, defines precarity as a generalized state of insecurity that cuts across traditional social divisions between different classes. So these insecurities, they can be objective and material, and has to do with welfare, but they also affect sort of emotional and subjective aspects of our lives. We feel insecure, we cannot plan for the future, and so forth. So when people talk, the critique of the neoliberal reforms and the way they have created precarious people is often comes from a social justice perspective. So there is a scholar called Guy Standing who has written a book called The Precariat, and he says that what we witness today is a new class, the precariat, not the proletariat. And the precariat have peoples in it that normally are put against each other, but they actually share something. They are migrants and workers. They often put against each other in right-wing movements or right-wing parties' way of describing the problem today, that the migrants take the jobs of the workers. But what Guy Standing wants to say that they actually share something. They share the precarious condition produced by neoliberal reforms. And I think this is very important. I'm coming to my own critique now. The social justice question is very important because it means that the precaritization of political but also social conditions, it harbors a potential but also a risk. So the potential is that if these groups that often are put against each other, and they often sort of put against each other in the rhetoric of the right-wing parties, if these groups could see that they share material and social conditions, they share a situation of having to compete with each other for social security, status, and positions, they could actually join forces. And when we talk about the precariat, we often mean also highly educated young people. A lot of young people today don't have jobs, and they have a lot of education, but they cannot have a secure job, and they cannot plan for the future. They have to live with their parents. They can't find a house and so forth. But there's also a risk with this, and that this is not only a question of social justice, I think. It's also a question of democracy, and that is where our article comes in. It's written together with a colleague of mine, Sarah Kahn. So what happens with precarity is that what it means is that with this kind of individualization responsibility, you have freedom of choice, and you have to decide what you want to do in your life. But if you fail to compete for social status, security, position, it is also your fault. And this personalization responsibility, I think, is very precarious in itself, because it means that people may look for reassurance elsewhere. And I think that what the neoliberal government, or the neoliberal policies, they're sort of a Trojan horse within democracies that may risk creating a market for other forms. They may reproduce sort of support for more authoritarian forms if they promise social security. So I think this is an important question to understand that precarity is not only problematic from a social justice perspective. It doesn't only have to do with class questions and social justice, but with the sustainability of democracy itself.
And I think the situation in America with the election of President Trump and the way in which he sort of spoke to people that were affected by neoliberal reforms and so on demonstrates that, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed. I think it does. And I think, now social scientists have difficulties explaining the people, why people vote for Trump. But from my perspective, I think that the question of precarity, the uncertainty that you cannot plan for the future and if democracy is associated with the kind of politics that makes you insecure in your very being, because we're not only talking about people's real life, about having to support themselves, having to live a life, having a house and so forth. If that doesn't work, if democracy is associated with that gradual sort of precaritization of people's life, of course, democracy is getting a bad name, so to speak. And so it's a very bad link right now between democracy and neoliberalism. And I think that one has to separate the two strongly in the future.
And yet, the impression I get from, different things that I read at the moment is that democracy seems to have quite a close relationship with the state of the economy. So when the economy is going well, when everything's good, there's high employment, job growth, income growth, people are happy with democracy. But when there's a global downturn or something like that, people look to democracy and feel unhappy with democracy. And I just wonder, I haven't been able to quite tease this out in my thinking, but I wonder whether that goes to the question of social democracy and the fact that there are less and less social democracies around, even England, which still has the National Health Service, but it's being significantly undermined in a lot of ways. And so, do you have a view on how social democracy relates to this issue?
I think this is it's a very tricky question, the relationship between democracy. And I agree that the social democracy has very much been connected with economic growth. in some ways, not only with redistribution, but also with growth. And so this is the million-dollar questions, as you put it, how to reform democracy. Can democracy survive in a condition where there is not economic growth? Do we only need, Piketty, do we only need redistribution? Or do we have to rethink the system? And if so, where is democracy? I mean, this is a very interesting question, at least.
And finally, I spoke with Professor Fung about the relationship between representative democracy and free market capitalism, and also a bit about his work around workplace democracy. I hope to look at workplace democracy in more detail in a later season of the podcast. Professor Fung is the Ford Foundation Professor of Democracy and Citizenship in the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His research explores policies, practices, and institutional designs that deepen the quality of democratic governance. He focuses upon public participation, deliberation, and transparency. I've spoken to a number of other democratic theorists about the relationship between representative democracy and free market capitalism, and I'd be interested in your view on how democracy and capitalism interrelate.
That's a big question that obviously that many people have grappled with for quite a long time. A traditional perspective that I subscribe to most of the time is that capitalism or economic organization in which very powerful economic elite is a constraint on representative democracy. And so the social theorist from a while ago named Charles Lindblom put forth this thesis that capital constrains democracy in a particular way, because if a democracy tries to make decisions that capital doesn't like, then it will punish the system. And so those kinds of decisions never really come up, right? And so a particular example is during the financial crisis. I remember this very clearly. For the bank bailout, after the bank bailout, then President Obama came on and said, I hated it, you hated it, everybody hated it, right? So that illustrates if everybody hated this policy, but they felt like they had to do it anyway, then why is that, right? It's one explanation is that they had to do it because that doing it was not very democratic at all, even though a vast majority of people really didn't like it. And that policy in part gave birth to the Tea Party, the contemporary Tea Party. Then another set of forces, a much more concentrated interest in society, namely banking interests in this case, were able to get their way in public policy, right? And so that is distortion of democracy, where the idea of democracy is that everyone's interests are counted equally and everybody has equal opportunity for political influence. So that's one kind of distortion. I think in the contemporary realm, the tension between free market capitalism and representative democracy plays out, and another tension between representative democracy and free market capitalism is playing out at the level of scale mismatch, right? And so many of the convulsions that we're seeing in Western democracies in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, in the Netherlands, and other places, part of the cause of that is because representative government operates at the national scale, but right now, economic capitalism operates at the global scale. And so the mechanisms that connect social interests to the regulatory capacity, the capacity of public power to regulate capitalism, operate at different scales. And so what's happening at the nation is not sufficient to regulate economic relationships and exchange, which is happening at the global scale. And many people being left out by that, on the losing side of that mismatch, recognize that the representative arrangements of the late 20th century are not performing for their interests. And so they're fighting back against those relationships right now. There's a scale mismatch. And I think that's part of what we're seeing.
A follow-up question is, you've done a bit of work, and it was probably a while ago, on workplace democracy. And I just wondered to what extent you felt that workplace democracy, what's the role of workplace democracy within a system of representative democracy?
Well, I'm fairly old-fashioned about this. I follow the basic logic of Robert Dahl and saying, look, the reason that, or an important reason that someone supports small d democracy, is a small d Democrat in the first place, is that a person thinks that it's important that people should be able to exercise some influence over the decisions that affect their lives, right? And so some of those decisions are public decisions about public investment, what the schools are like, what police are like, what environmental regulation is like, what economic policy is like, as we just talked about, right? And so that's one reason why we favor representative democracy or democracy in the political arena. But, most of us, those are pretty distant decisions, and they affect us, but not so tangibly and in the much longer term. Most of us many of us spend about 8 or 10 hours every day at work. And so all of the decisions there, in some ways, are much, much more tangible. And to the extent that work is organized kind of hierarchically or even in an authoritarian way, we don't really have all that much influence over all of these decisions that really affect our lives. Now, someone could say, and I think it's right, unlike a country, most people are stuck in their country, but if you don't like your particular job or the rules that govern the workplace, you could get a different job. And I think that's a real kind of, exit is a real kind of influence over what kind of workplace you're in. But even given the possibility of exit, I still think that workplace democracy is important, and employees should have some kind of influence over the decisions at work. For the very same reason that we favor political democracy, we should favor. You have to work out, it's kind of complicated, what that would look like in different workplaces in different contexts. But the basic argument, I think, holds is, look, we care about how decisions are made in our political lives for the very same reason we should care about how they're made in our work lives, because those are important decisions that affect us.
Thank you for joining me today. In the next episode of Real Democracy Now! A podcast, I'll be talking with Dr. Simon Longstaff, the Executive Director of the Ethics Centre here in Australia, about ethics and democracy. He touches on democracy and capitalism too. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.